Hi, you're listening to Gary Zacharias and the Apologist Bookshelf. Lee Strobel doesn't need an introduction, does he? Case for Christ, Case for Faith, Case for Miracles, a lot of good books. The one I wanted to look at today, and I've done one previous podcast on it that talked about Michael Behe. He has a chapter on Behe and the molecular machines on the microscopic level. So his book is called A Case for Creator, and I wanted to look at the opening chapter where he's talking about, it's actually chapter 3, but it's rest of those chapters are just kind of introductory material. And chapter 3 is talking about doubts about Darwinism. And he opens it by saying, no educated person any longer questions the validity of the so-called theory of evolution, which we now know to be a simple fact. That's from an evolutionary biologist. Here's another quote. Scientists who utterly reject evolution may be one of our fastest-growing controversial minorities. Many of the scientists supporting this position hold impressive credentials in science. Wow, that's just the opposite, isn't it? So he starts off by saying that there was a series, I say he, this is Strobel, Lee Strobel, that there was a series for PBS on evolution called Evolution. And he quotes some of the people on that show. All known scientific evidence supports Darwinian evolution. Virtually every reputable scientist in the world does, on and on. And it said, be careful, though. It said there are people out there, and it said they're not narrow-minded fundamentalists or backwoods West Virginia protesters or some kind of religious fanatic. It said there's some world-class scientists who are questioning evolution. For example, Nobel nominee Henry Schaefer, third most cited chemist in the world. James Tour, he's a Rice University professor in nanotechnology, amazing person. And Fred Figworth, a professor of cellular and molecular physiology at Yale Graduate School. So he said, there's a lot out there. People are starting to, it's politically incorrect, but they're starting to say, wait a minute, the emperor of evolution has no clothes. So he's, how he works his books. He always goes to somebody who's an expert in the field. So this interview is with Jonathan Wells. Sad to hear, he just passed away not too long ago when I did this podcast. But Jonathan Wells, PhD, 2 PhDs. He worked at the Discovery Institute. He was a senior fellow with the Institute's Center for Science and Culture. And it said he really likes to study not only hard science, but the way science influences our broader society. Had an undergraduate degree from UC Berkeley. It was in geology and physics, a minor in biology. He went to Yale, to their graduate school, got a doctorate in religious studies. And then he got a doctorate in molecular and cell biology from Berkeley. Man, that just wears me out, all the work that he's done. He had a book out called Icons of Evolution. And that's what Lee Strobel is going to talk to him about. It was published in the year 2000. And I like it because it took a look at visual images that had convinced Lee Strobel of the truth of Darwinian evolution. Like what? Well, the Urey Miller experiment, Darwin's Tree of Life, a man named Haeckel and his embryos, the Archaeopteryx missing link. He said all of them were there in that book. And so he was curious. He wanted to sit down with them. He said these are evolution's best evidence, right? They're called icons, something that's really powerful. And he says, if you talk to any scientist to say, what's the evidence for evolution and what's the evidence for Darwinism, boom, boom, out come these same examples. He said they're in textbooks. He said that's what students get taught. They become the evidence, right? Underline the evidence for evolution. So those are some of the icons that he shared with, that Lee Strobel shared with Wells that he grew up with. And so Lee said, are there other icons? And yeah, Wells said, there are the 4 that you mentioned, the Miller-Urey experiment, Darwin's Tree of Life, the embryos, the Archaeopteryx, right? So there's those 4. But he said there's the similarity of bone structures that are shown, bat's wing, porpoise flipper, horse leg, human hand. So they said, see, you have a common ancestor. He says also you get pictures in textbooks of peppered moths on tree trunks. Why is that important to evolution? Because it shows how camouflage and predatory birds result in natural selection. Then there's Darwin's finches. They're the birds on the Galapagos Islands that are used to support natural selection. And then he said maybe the most famous icon, though, is the drawing that you see in so many textbooks, the march of ape-like creatures as they begin to evolve over the page into human beings, which suggests that we're just animals that evolved by a purposeless natural cause of some kind. So he says, well, let's talk about evolution in general. And Wells said it's not really talking about change over time. When scientists talk about evolution, they have the theory that all living creatures are modified descendants of a common ancestor that lived long, long ago. In fact, Wells is saying we are seen as descendants of ape-like ancestors. So in fact, we share a common ancestor with fruit flies. So he says Darwinism claims every new species that's ever appeared could be explained by descent with modification. And how does it get modified? Natural selection, acting on genetic mutations. So he said that's what they're talking about when they talk about evolution. So he said, all right, let's just take some of these images. How about image 1? That's that Miller experiment. He says, well, was the atmosphere the correct one that was inside the flask? And Wells says, nope, it wasn't like that at all. And in fact, by 1995, Science magazine said that the experts are now dismissing Miller's experiments. But the problem is they're still there, in textbooks. And so just real quickly, because he doesn't go into a ton of detail on this, but what happened was they took what they thought was the early Earth atmosphere back in the 1950s, Miller and Urey, and they zapped it with a little electrode, and they got some amino acids, and they said, that's how you get life. And so Lee Strobel says, all right, so they had the wrong atmosphere, the wrong gases. So what would happen if you replayed that experiment now, but you used the correct atmosphere? Wells says, I'll tell you this, you don't get amino acids. Oh, oops. He says, all right, so Lee Strobel says, all right, well, let's say someday a scientist is able to produce amino acids from the realistic atmosphere. Would that be close to creating a living cell? Oh, says Wells, very far, incredibly far. He said you'd have to get the right number of the right kinds of amino acids to link up to create a protein molecule, and that's still a long way from a living cell. Then you need dozens of protein molecules in the right sequence to create a living cell. He said the odds against this are astonishing. He said just the gap between non-living chemicals and even the most primitive living organism is absolutely tremendous. So he said you got to assemble the right parts in the right way at the right time in the right place, and you got to keep out the wrong material. So he said that just seems silly to him. Said there's Miller experiment. He said it's prominently featured. He says even today in textbooks, and he said it's really a shame. He said it's misleading. He said it's wrong to even give the impression that science has empirically shown how life could have originated. He said, what's going on? He said, that's materialistic philosophy that's masquerading as real science, right? In other words, philosophy wins out. So as Lee is talking to Jonathan Wells, said he started thinking about another person he talked to at one time, Walter Bradley. He wrote The Mystery of Life's Origins. And he said he'd questioned Bradley about all these different theories about how you get that first living cell to generate it. Random chance, or maybe deep sea ocean vents, and maybe seeding from outer space. And Bradley said not one of them can stand up to scientific scrutiny. And he said that's not the only person. So Lee Strobel quotes a journalist, Greg Easterbrook. Now, he was writing about the origin of life field, and here's a quote from Easterbrook. Science doesn't have the slightest idea how life began. No generally accepted theory exists, and the steps leading from a barren primordial world to the fragile chemistry of life seems imponderable. Oh, man, that's sad, huh? How about icon number 2, right? So icon 1 was that Miller-Urey experiment. It does not work. It does not hold up. It should be out of every textbook, but it's still around. So number 2, what about the image of the tree of life, right? So that idea that at the bottom of the tree, like at the trunk, were those primitive one-celled animals, and then kind of like as the tree grows, you get branches, then you get animals mutating and turning into different animals and all until we get us, right? That everybody had a common ancestor, and natural selection drove the development of all these different organisms that we see in the modern world today. So, of course, key question that Lee's going to ask Jonathan, has this tree held up? Quick answer, absolutely not. He said, if that's a look at the fossil record, if they're trying to reproduce what the fossil record looks like, it's a dismal failure. He said, it is a good representation of Darwin's theory. It's good for the theory. It just doesn't work in the real world. And he said, in fact, and this is Jonathan Wells speaking, he said Darwin knew that the fossil record in his time didn't support his tree. He said he even knew at that time that major groups of animals appeared to sort of pop all of a sudden into the fossil record. And that wasn't what his theory predicted. I mean, for Darwin, it's got to be a long history of gradual divergence from a common ancestor, with differences getting bigger and bigger until you get all the huge differences that we have today. But even the fossil evidence of Darwin's day showed the opposite, that there were these explosions in different structures of animals. And it was called the Cambrian explosion, sometimes called the biological Big Bang, because it brought most of the major animal groups that are still alive today. So he said, here's what the record shows. And this is Jonathan Wells speaking. Before the Cambrian, there were some jellyfish and sponges and worms. He said, then at the beginning of the Cambrian, boom! He said, we get arthropods. Like today would be the insects, crabs, and the like, echinoderms, I guess. That's modern starfish and sea urchins. You get modern vertebrates. Mammals came along later. But all of this is contrary to Darwin's tree of life. The animals that are so different appear fully developed all of a sudden. It said paleontologists call that the single most spectacular phenomenon of the fossil record. Oh, man. That's sad, isn't it? Doesn't work for the Darwinists. What about number 3? Okay, so now we've got the Darwin's tree, didn't work out very well, and the Miller-Urey experiment didn't work out very well for evolution. But what about Haeckel's embryos? All right, well, there's Ernst Haeckel was his name, lived a long time ago, and he sketched vertebrate embryology, right? When these embryos of fish and salamander and tortoise and chicken and hog, he took all of these embryos and put them side by side at 3 stages of development. And man, you can see striking similarities between these early embryos. And that's supposed to show that all organisms share a universal ancestor. So Lee says to Jonathan Wells, he said, did you have the same reaction that I did when you first saw those drawings? Looked like strong evidence for Darwinism, didn't it? And Wells said, yeah, it was the first time I looked at them, yes. He said, it wasn't until I started doing my graduate work that I looked at actual photos of embryos, compared those to what Haeckel had drawn. And Lee said, what'd you find? So Jonathan Wells says, I was stunned. They didn't fit. There's a big discrepancy. He said, it was really hard to believe. He says, here's the problem. The similarities of their early stages were faked. Faked. And he says you could call them fudged or distorted or misleading. He said they were faked. So he said he had his theory first, then he just kind of sketched stuff out so it would match his theory. He said he doctored drawings to make them look more similar than they really are. They misrepresent the embryos. So Strobel, of course, has his mouth open going, wow. He said, how long have we known this? And Wells said they were first exposed in the 1860s. His colleagues even then accused him of fraud. He said they're still being used today, even in upper division textbooks on evolutionary biology. Wells said that he looked at 10 recent textbooks and to see how accurately they dealt with the topic. He said 8 of them got an F, 2 of them got a D. Wow, that's really sad. So that's not good. It says, first of all, Haeckel cherry-picked his examples. He only shows a few of the several vertebrate classes. Right? And said he omits some early stages completely. He says they look very, very different about that. It says embryos are not similar to each other that he's done. So I will skip over that. Pretty amazing. Let's go to image number 4. How about Archaeopteryx, right? What's going on there? Well, when Darwin wrote The Origin of Species in 1859, he conceded that the biggest objection that people would come up with against his theory is the fossil record doesn't back up what he has said. And the problem is the fossil record hasn't gotten any better after all these years. But scientists unearthed this thing called Archaeopteryx, right, in a German quarry. Boy, the Darwin supporters were so happy. It looked like a link between reptiles and modern birds. And they said, there we go. That's validating Darwin's claim. Here's the animal that was kind of halfway in between. So one scientist said he actually fell upon his knees in awe when he saw one in Natural History Museum in England. Wow. So here's the problem. The fossil record, though, in general has let Darwin down. But what about Archaeopteryx, says Lee? Isn't it a half bird, half reptile? What's Wells say? No, not even close. It's a bird with modern feathers, and birds are really different from reptiles in all sorts of ways. The way they breed, their system for breeding, their bone structure, their lungs, the distribution of weight and muscles. It's a bird. He says there's no doubt about it. It's not part bird and part reptile. So he said, it's a bird, and he said the fossils that look most like the reptile ancestors of birds occur tens of millions of years later in the fossil record. The missing link is still missing. They're still looking for some kind of ancestor to go between birds and reptiles. So Lee says the Archaeopteryx is not an ancestor of modern birds. He says, no, not at all. He says paleontologists pretty much agree on that. There's just too many structural differences. Here's one person. He's an ardent evolutionist. His name is Pierre Lacombe de Noix. He's French, so pardon my butchering the French language here. But here's what he had to say. We're not even authorized to consider the exceptional case of the Archaeopteryx as a true link. He says by link, we mean a necessary stage of transition between classes like reptiles and birds or between smaller groups. So it's not transitional. And it said, even if it was, and it's not, but even if it was, the fossil record has just been devastating to classical Darwinism. Yeah, terrible. There have been all sorts of frauds in the past, and I'll skip over that. Java Man was an example of a fraud, but there were a lot more. Let me skip past this section here. So, it says, at the end of our discussion about the fossil record, this is Lee Strobel now talking, I reflected back on the four images that had paved the way for my descent into atheism. I was left with an origin of life experiment whose results have been rendered meaningless. Of course, that's the Miller-Urey. A tree of life that had been uprooted by the biological Big Bang of the Cambrian explosion. There's no tree of life. In fact, the latest I heard is that the best way you want to think about species is to think of it like grass, right? I mean, just sprouts coming up all over the place, not a tree coming out of one source there. Here's the third one that Strobel said was powerful to him, made him become an atheist. Doctored embryo drawings that don't reflect reality. Those are Haeckel's embryos, his drawings. And then the fourth is this fossil record. It refuses to give up transitional forms that you needed for evolutionary theory. Doubts piled on doubts. Yeah. Now, toward the end of the chapter, he's talking to Wells again. Wells says, I believe science is pointing strongly toward design. He said, to me, as a scientist, if you look at an embryo and its development, it cries out design. He said the Cambrian explosion, that sudden appearance of all this complex life, no evidence of ancestors. He says that's way more consistent with design than evolution. He said the origin of life seems to cry out for a designer. None of these things make as much sense from a Darwinian perspective as they do from a design perspective. So that's, by the way, at the end of the book here, at the end of the chapter, I think there are 4 books that are mentioned that you could go to for further information. One is Michael Denton's book, Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. One is Philip Johnson's book, Darwin on Trial. And the third one is, of course, the book that he's been dealing with here as he's talked to Jonathan Wells. That's Wells' book called Icons of Evolution. So I'm hoping that gives you kind of an idea of one chapter here that Lee Strobel covers. I like this book well enough. I'll certainly be coming back to it. The strength of Lee Strobel books to me is he goes to people who know what they're talking about, but Lee becomes kind of our our voice, right? He asks the questions that we would ask. He tries to get clarification if the scientists get a little too fancy and too difficult to follow. So I like anything Strobel puts out. And by the way, this is an older book now, so it won't have the newest revelations, but I can tell you from other things I've read, the case for a creator has gotten stronger, not weaker, since Lee Strobel wrote this book. So this is still a good book, even though it's not brand new. It came out in 2004. And, of course, the result of that is, since it's an older book and it was a big seller, you can find them cheap. Probably, I don't know where, but different places will have them, and you could get one for a really good price. Excellent book. Well, thank you so much for being part of our podcast. Talk to you again later.